I had to do a video on this because I saw there was a bit of controversy last year about David Lammy, who's a Labour MP. He's centrist. I'm not a fan of him particularly. I agree with some of the stuff he says, but the majority I don't agree. And the whole thing with what he said was, he said he wants to be considered an English person on the UK census, even though he's a black person, or he has no English or very little English DNA, what we call the DNA. Now, he has no markers that descended from ancestral English tribes like these Anglo-Saxons or Celts or whatever that lived here hundreds of years ago, that have become the ethnic group or the race of English people. Can David Lammy, as a black person, a black Caribbean person, even though the Caribbean doesn't really have black people, because the black people were took there as slaves originally from Africa. Really, his ancestral DNA is African. The actual native Caribbean people who lived there in the Caribbean, that apparently now most of them have been extinct because they were killed or moved because of colonialism, they looked like Native Americans. They had phenotypic markers that were typical to Americans. They had a similar face structure, skin colour, eye colour, hair colour and so forth, because they obviously descended from a similar grouping of people hundreds or thousands of years ago. So, but they've all gone now, so the Caribbean blacks are essentially descended from Africa. Now, if you go back far enough, you can, if the theory of out of Africa is correct, you could say that we're all African, but no one says that because that's a ridiculous concept. It is true that if you go back far enough, you could say that there's no such thing as ethnicities, we're all just one human race. But here's the thing, everyone knows that as a matter of kind of human interaction, social interaction, we do categorise people based upon their traits, based upon their physical appearance. We categorise other humans into ethnic or racial groups. Whether that's right or wrong, we do that in the modern world. Whether we did that hundreds and hundreds of years ago, some people would say is bollocks, we didn't do that. I believe that we still did. We still would have grouped people based on their physical appearance hundreds of years ago. Whether you would have had the same amount of variation in phenotypes, I don't know. But my guess is there would have been, at least until, at least going back 10,000 years. I'm assuming, obviously, when the first anatomical humans came into being. I mean, this is a very complicated subject because humans have I mean, humans have been around, depending on what you define as a human, for hundreds of thousands of years. But us, Homo sapiens, have not been around for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. I think we've only been around for possibly 100,000 years, or maybe a bit more. But it's not a massive amount of time. But before us, there would have been, before anatomically modern humans, whatever we descended from, the other primates. Ultimately, this is the basic. Going back on myself, this is the basic issue. Okay. The question is race and ethnicity the same thing, or are they different? Now, I believe, having researched this extensively, I believe they are one and the same concept. I believe that race is the same concept as ethnicity, and I believe that both of them essentially can be defined as your perceived ancestral DNA, your perceived descent, based upon your phenotypes, based upon how you look. That's what essentially we do, based upon your eye colour, your hair colour, your skin colour, your face structure, and so forth. When people say that you're English, or you're Chinese, or you're Indian, or you're an American Indian, or you're an Australian person, or you're a Brazilian person, or a Native American person, they get at your phenotypic markers. which are the traits that come from the DNA. Because of course, someone living in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's super hot, the skin colour is adapted to handle all that sunlight, and you have dark skin. If you live in England, which is a freezing cold, crap, terrible climate country, you have a much lighter skin, because to adapt to the environment. And there's loads of other types of adaptations, like the adaptations of the Eskimos that can take, because of their harsh environment, and these are an unusual culture, by the way, in terms of their diet, because it's not a natural human diet what they actually eat, the whale blubber and meat and all that. They have a massive liver, I believe, to handle all the cholesterol that they eat, because they eat an unbelievable amount of cholesterol, because there's no vegetable or starch in sight in their harsh climate. So their Mother Nature has adapted them to have this capacity to handle all that DNA. And there's loads of other little changes. Now, what does it actually mean? Well, what it means is that there are slight, and I mean tiny, variations in DNA, because a phenotypic marker, a trait, is stemming from DNA. It stems from what your basic, the basic building blocks of human life, or all of life, the DNA. It's stemming from that. So it is true that humans do have slight variations in physical, in DNA, in genetics. Essentially, we are genetically slightly different. Now, and that those differences can be tracked over ethnicities. So we could say that most Indian people have dark skin, dark eyes, and they look a certain way, dark hair colour, and so we claim that that's an Indian person. Now, the question is then, is ethnicity, is it different than race? But the question is basically, to make ethnicity different, is ethnicity a cultural grouping? Now, I believe everyone can just think of a very simple thought experiment that would totally deny the difference between race and ethnicity. And just imagine this, you can pick any country in the world, but imagine an African child that was black, that had all the phenotypes of an African person, the hair, the skin colour, the nose, the mouth, everything. If we took that African baby that was just born, 1 hour after it's born, and we went to a hospital in Hong Kong and plonked it down, and we got a Chinese family, a Han Chinese family, to bring that child up, would that African child be ethnically Chinese? I mean, the question, it's an unanswerable question, because it all depends on how you define ethnicity. Now, I believe that the vast majority of people would say that that kid is not ethnically Chinese, because he has phenotypic markers or a perceived genetic descent from African people, at least more recently than the Chinese people did. Because ultimately, if you go back maybe 80,000 years, we all came from Africa. So we're all African in that sense, but no one thinks like that. We think of our more modern iterations of descent, if you will, and whether it's right or wrong, we do group people like this. And so most people, I believe, would say that child that grew up in China, that he's Chinese, he speaks the Chinese language, he eats everything Chinese, he's a typical Chinese person, but he is black, the kid is black, and he has no Chinese recent DNA in him. So is the kid Chinese or African? Well, I believe most people would say that that kid is ethnically African, because he has recent African DNA, perceived DNA, because it may be wrong, he may have been from a different part, but I don't think it is wrong. So because of that, ethnicity cannot possibly be considered a cultural marker. It cannot be considered a cultural grouping, because people would not consider him a Chinese person in the sense of Chinese ethnicity or race. If you use the word race, he would definitely not be. considered Chinese. If you use the word ethnicity, I believe he definitely wouldn't either. Now, if you read some definitions on the internet, they say that ethnicity is to do with your cultural grouping. But if that were true, the African kid growing up in China would be an ethnic Chinese, and that is total BS. He wouldn't be. And if I grew up as a kind of white person in England, if I grew up in India, no one in India, even if I'd never left the country, I'd only ever been to one part of India, and I grew up there, and I was a 16-year-old kid, and I looked as the way I do, which is white. I don't look completely typically English, but I am. Most of my DNA is ancestrally English from Anglo-Saxon. Ultimately, I would not be considered an Indian person. I would be considered I would not be considered an Indian person. I would be considered an English person, an ethnic English living in whose nationality and culture is Indian. I would not be an ethnic Indian. I wouldn't be, because my phenotypic markers are not Indian. You can see that by looking at me. And you can also see, so clearly, in my opinion, and you can take this for practically any country in the world, and you can do a similar thing. You could take a Native American child and bring it to England and say, is that kid English? Now, obviously, in terms of the nationality, yes, I would be a national Indian. Or the black kid would be a national Chinese, but he would not be an ethnic or racial Chinese, and I would not be an ethnic or racial Indian. That's an impossibility under the way that we as humans perceive each other in this world. And that has to be stemming from, some people believe that race and ethnicity kind of as a concept has only been around for a few hundred years. I think that is wrong. I think that we would have, thousands of years ago, if we saw different tribes that had different phenotypic markers, we would have considered them, even though we consider them human, we would consider them of a different ethnic or racial grouping. We would have thought that they have slightly different DNA than us, even if it's tiny, we still think they have slightly different DNA than us because they have different phenotypic markers like skin colour and eye colour and facial structure because of the particular adaptation to the environment of where your ancestral DNA came from. That's what it ultimately is. At least that's the way we perceive the world. And I believe, even though we didn't have a clue what DNA meant, I believe that we would have still believed that there is some differences in humans based upon this concept of race or ethnicity or something similar. I think it's just a way that we as humans view the world, and to some degree, even though the vast majority of what makes us a human being is the same essentially in all humans, even though some people are lactose intolerant, some people are not, some people are allergic to dust mite, others are not. All these are differences in genetics. You can have differences in genetics in the same race. You have differences in personality. Some people are more Machiavellian, more selfish. Other people are more altruistic and more sharing and giving and cooperative. Some people are not. Some people are introverts versus extroverts. These all stem from DNA. Now, ultimately, I believe they stem from DNA anyway. I believe that in the nature versus nurture debate, I believe the majority of it stems from nature, not nurture. The majority. Some of the environment can have it, and there are some things that are socially constructed, but ultimately I think a lot of our personality and you know, the way that we act and our behaviour unfortunately comes from nature. This is for another video, but so what it means is that yes, there are slight differences in our DNA between humans, even though we are essentially one grouping of people in the sense that we are the human race. But there are very, very slight differences. But that says nothing, okay? You could have an Indian child, you could have a Chinese child, you could have a Native American, a Native Australian, a Native Thai. You could take any of those kids from the parents at 1 hour old, and you could plop them in in a hospital, cot in America, in New York, and they could become a NASA scientist working in America, or a rocket scientist, or a doctor, or an accountant, or a lawyer, or a software engineer, or anything. Or they could be just, and all of them could be Machiavellian, or they could be introverts, or they could be extroverts. They could still have, there is no such thing as one race or one ethnic grouping having, being a certain behavioural way because of their DNA. Maybe because of their culture, but not because of their DNA, in my opinion. I mean, the question of whether or not different people who have physical, so the different racial groupings that we've just said exist, whether or not they can also give differences in behaviour slightly more than other groups. So would ethnic Chinese people be more cooperative than ethnic English people, or does the differences in their culture arise from the actual environment differences, not arising, from actual genetic differences? That's a question that some people would say you are a racist if you believe there are differences in behaviour in different races. But ultimately, there is no such thing as a difference between race and ethnicity. They are one and the same thing that have to do with your perceived ancestral descent, who you descended from, which has to do with your phenotypic markers, which is the traits that make you appear the way that you do. Your eye colour, your facial structure, your hair colour, your skin colour. These slight genetic differences have to do with where you descended from, ultimately. And that is why there is no such thing as culture coming into play with your ethnicity. You can be culturally American, culturally English, culturally Chinese, and have no DNA or no recent DNA of historic Chinese people, or historic wherever the culture that you are just referred to comes from. And that is just a fact. And so it's the way that we view the world. It's the way that we view the world, but we need to get away from the idea that there is a difference between race and ethnicity. There's not. And we need to get away from the idea that there is a cultural linking, a cultural expression with your ethnicity. There isn't. Your ethnicity is determined by your phenotypic markers. That is how Homo sapiens view each other, at least in the modern world. That is, in my opinion, a fact. I just thought I'd point this out because there is a massive debate, or there was months ago, last year, about David Lammy. To answer the question, in my opinion, David Lammy is an English person in the sense of English nationality, but in the sense of his ethnic grouping, no, he's an African person because of his phenotypic markers, his DNA. That is just the way that we view the world, even though it might not be right, and it might. I mean, when you talk about this subject, it almost feels like it's difficult to do so because you'll be branded a racist. But the more I think about this, the more it seems as though it's in every culture to think like this. I go to Thailand a lot, and ultimately, Thai people, they do not believe that they would call me a Farang because I'm white English. A Farang means a white Westerner, basically. They would never ever say that I was an ethnic Thai. If I grew up in Thailand and I had never met my English parents and I grew up in Thailand, they would never ever say that I'm a Thai person. They would never say that I'm a Thai person, full stop. They would say I'm a Farang. Even though I'd grown up in Thailand, spoke the language, eat the food, do everything, they would say he is a Farang. Now, if that was me in Thailand, that was really true, I would feel offended. I would say, of course I'm a Thai person. But then when you actually look at what he means, they mean his ethnicity, which is not his cultural grouping. They mean his ancestral DNA, or his perceived ancestral DNA, because he more recently descended from English people who were white, who adapted to the English area of Western Europe, and he doesn't have brown skin, and he doesn't have, black hair, and he doesn't have all the other phenotypic markers of Thai people, so he's not Thai. That's what they would think, and that's the way it seems that everyone in this world, at least in the modern world, sees races and ethnicity. This is the way that we view other humans on the planet, unfortunately, under this banner of your phenotypic markers, under your traits, your physical appearance. It is unfortunately true that we do this. Whether it's right or wrong, we do seem to do it. And so when I thought of it more and more, I thought that, well, ultimately, that is. Oh, and I should also point out as well that when I say ancestral DNA, it is true that a lot of people in Britain will have Scandinavian, French, other Italian, other parts of Europe, that DNA, even if it's only slight, ultimately you can be a part of an ethnic group, because it's only perceived. You can be a part of an ethnic group with a proportion of your DNA. You proportion. So, if most of my DNA is English, then I would generally be considered an English DNA, an English person ethnicity. You don't have to be completely 100%, but it's about the amount, and ultimately, because of course, with more and more DNA marker, you will have more phenotypic markers that are English. And I mean, I've gone on and on, but ultimately, those two things, I believe, are how we perceive the world, and cultural linkages to ethnicity are false. We don't view the world in that way. We view it as your perceived genetic descent, unfortunately. That is how we view the world. And I believe that is, even though I don't particularly like it, I believe that is ultimately natural for humans to do it, at least in the modern world. It does seem to be. I don't think this is just coming from culture, from the modern world of knowing about DNA and knowing about ancestry. I think this is coming from some type of human, Mother Nature's choices in the way that she did this to kind of, I don't know, but it seems as though this is a natural part of human experience to think like this in this way. So it seems to be natural, not just a social construct, even if ultimately we're all part of the same human race. We're all one. We've all got 99% or whatever it is, 99.999% of the same DNA. The slight differences that give the slight phenotypic marker differences, they are enough for us to group one another into different groups, because they give rise to differences in the way that we appear. But even though we still understand that we're all the same species, we do believe that there are different groupings of humans based upon their phenotypic markers, and that is unfortunately what we do. And I believe that has probably been the case for thousands of years, before we had the word race or ethnicity or DNA or anything like that. We still understood that, oh yeah, he's come from people, he has the blood of X, he has the blood of X, he's not the same as me, he's different slightly because he has that appears to be how we as humans view the world, view each other, I should say, view other humans. Even if it's wrong, it seems to be true that we do that. So anyway, I just thought I'd post that up there. I'm going to be posting some videos just on some quick topics just to go through because I'm interested in it, and ultimately I think it is extremely interesting that the concept of race and ethnicity is extremely interesting in that it does, even though I'm completely opposed to racism, I'm completely opposed to policies that would discriminate. I'm a communist. I believe in a totally democratic world where everything is democratic. But I just thought I'd point out that this issue of race and ethnicity is something very, very fundamental to human beings. And I believe it does transcend capitalism in the sense that it's been around before capitalism, even though DNA is not. It's been around before, 300, 400 years ago, whenever you could say that capitalism has come about. Some people will say it's more recent than that. Some people will say that wage slavery, etc., began probably about 400 years ago with the advent of, the East India Company and the colonialism of Europe, how we conquered the world and did all the terrible things that they did. Ultimately, I think that race and ethnicity as the same concept has essentially existed, even though they've not described it as that. I believe we had this concept as a part of humans for thousands of years, unfortunately. It's just a natural way that we group each other. So I've blabbed on quite a bit there, but I just thought I'd do that because I thought it was interesting. And I thought that it puts another view on ethnicity and race that is not said out there. Everyone else is telling people that race and ethnicity are different things. They are not. They are one and the same. Thanks.